Great, thanks, Chuck. Well, it's great to be finally talking about this. We're going to be talking about a couple efforts that have been going on for quite a while, and I think will be of interest to a lot of folks. So excited to be sharing. So quick background, this is talking about two different efforts that are related. One effort is by the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils, and I'll talk in a moment about who that is, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. But that effort was to develop best practices for assessing and listing invasive plants. And then the California Invasive Plant Council, as a member of the National Association, we were due for an update to our list of invasive plants. And so we followed the best practices developed by National IPC in our inventory update, and we actually took on some new things as well, which we'll talk about. So I'm going to talk about kind of the context for all of this, and then I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague Mona Robeson to talk about the revision of and update of CalIPC's list, and then I'll take it back again and talk about the National Invasive Plant Council's best practices. So quickly, who is CalIPC? And this is kind of standing in also as a proxy for IPCs across the country, invasive plant councils. So we are a statewide environmental nonprofit organization, and we've been around over 25 years now. And our goal is to bring together practitioners with research ecologists, and we also are engaged with volunteer efforts as well, although that's somewhat secondary to working with the professional land managers. So what we're looking at here, we've got state agency folks like the top left, CAL FIRE work crew working on giant reed, Arundo Donax in a riparian area. Clockwise from there is an agricultural biologist from a county agricultural commissioner's office sampling plants along a leading edge leading into the Sierra Nevada mountains. And to the right of that is a federal employee working for the Park Service treating weeds up in Yosemite National Park. On the bottom right, those are Conservation Corps workers hired by a water district to work on invasive plants on their lands. In the middle on the bottom is a school group in Southern California working in a wetland, and on the bottom left are restoration volunteers working in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that's generally the type of mix that an invasive plant council may bring to bear. Folks working on public lands at the local, state, and federal level, private lands, and volunteer efforts. So the main things that CalIPC works on are training, so providing an annual conference, particular training events, printed materials, online materials, so that land managers can do what they do. We also, in recent years, have taken on the role of working with regional partners to coordinate, collaborate, and plan regional projects and then secure funding to implement those projects, typically aimed at early eradication. And then we also do advocacy, mostly in Sacramento, but a little bit in DC as well, in support of sound policy and funding for invasive plant management. And the graphic here is a screenshot from an online tool, Cal Weed Mapper, that is used in planning regional projects. It's a decision support tool that we've designed. I'm showing it here in part because it is based on our list of invasive plant species. This basically shows map spatial information distribution across the state for each of the invasive plant species we list. So who is the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils? Well, it's groups like ours across the country. There are individual state councils. There also are regional collaborations like the Midwest Invasive Plant Network or the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council. So there are people organized in a majority of the states doing this work. And I guess before moving on from that, I should just mention that the reason that we work in association is to take on projects and goals that are of use to all of us. And so this effort towards best practices for assessing and listing invasive plants was seen as something that we all do and we can all benefit from, and there are reasons to move forward together. So invasive plant lists are a primary function of what most, if not all, state invasive plant councils do. And they serve several important purposes. Initially and primarily, they were there to inform land managers who are making decisions about how to protect their lands, whether they're managing for habitat quality or wildfire safety or agricultural productivity. What are the impacts of particular plants? What's the biology of particular plants? So that you can prioritize what you want to do on your land to meet your goals. In more recent years, an additional purpose has emerged, which is to help with horticulture to keep it from introducing new weeds or continue to introduce existing weeds. And I think there's been a growth in awareness within the green industry and within natural resource management circles that this is an important part of the equation to address prevention. And so informing landscaping guidelines appropriately requires having good science-based information on which plants are invasive, how much, in what sort of circumstances, that type of thing. So to form an invasive plant list, you're looking at a couple of things. The main thing that IPCs have looked at traditionally is what's currently causing a problem. What do we know is problematic in our wildlands in our state? More recently, we've started to look at future risk. We've always looked at future risk a little bit for the plants that are already invasive here. Yes, this is invasive now. Is it going to actually get even worse in the future? We've looked at things like that, but this is looking at things that are not invasive yet. They aren't causing problems in our state, but we have reason to suspect that they could be a problem in the future. They may already be escaped and land managers are noticing them. How can we tell which of those plants are the highest risk for actually becoming a problem in the future? So we'll talk some about that. So as the title makes clear, there are two general aspects to this process. One is assessment of each plant and its impacts, its ability to spread, how widely distributed it is, those type of things. And that's primarily a technical task, and it uses a criteria system. It's systematic and it categorizes plants as, at least as invasive or not significantly invasive. But usually within invasive, there might be several categories, like a severe invasive or a not so bad invasive. And the goals for that are to be science-based, to be complete, and covering all the territory that needs to be covered, to be consistent in the analysis of different plants and how you categorize them, and then to have concurrence between various reviewers and various stakeholders that yes, this all makes sense. And then listing is a more procedural task. It has to do with formalizing those assessments, taking those assessments and saying, okay, well, we found that these 20 plants are invasive, and we want you to use that list to do various things. Now, if it's informing land managers who are making decisions about priorities when they don't have enough money to do everything and they want to figure out what the most effective things to do are, that's one thing. But especially when we start to talk about things like we recommend you don't plant this plant anymore. You use these alternatives. That's where the procedural part of listing becomes very important, and goals like transparency and credibility are really important as well to make the list as useful as possible. So Mona's going to talk more about the particulars of our risk assessment, but CalIPC has had a list since 1996. We call it the inventory. The web page URL is listed up here, and it was printed in 1996, but obviously it's changed over time since then, and so we have an online database that is kept up to date. And both of those are available online, and it's based on a criteria system, at least it is now since 2006, a specific criteria system that was developed, and that is also posted on the website. So in 2006, there was early consisted of establishing that transparent criteria system and documenting all the decisions. Before that, it was basically a panel of experts using their expert knowledge to list the plants. So recently, at the 20-year mark, we undertook this most recent update, and so we had some backlog of things that plants that needed to be evaluated using the system we'd always used for evaluation, but we also had this big backlog of plants that were knocking on the door. It felt like weren't causing big impacts yet, so it'd be pretty difficult to evaluate them based on impacts, but we wanted to make sure people knew which of those to prioritize in terms of which things they paid attention to. So we added a new category for plants rated watch plants, which are not technically invasive, but they're ones that are at risk of becoming invasive, and so we want land managers and people making landscaping decisions to know about those. So to talk in more detail about all of this, I'm going to pass the mic over to Mona. She's our science program manager, and she's responsible for completing the inventory update and maintaining the inventory at this point. So I'll advance the slide, and you can tell me when to move on, Mona.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Hopefully, let me know if you have problems hearing me. Yeah, I'm pleased to be helping with this inventory update here in 2017. I came on to CalIPC at the beginning of January and worked really hard with our committee and Doug on this update. So the first thing we wanted to show you was our online database. So in the last slide, Doug showed there was a picture of our document, our paper document we produced in 2006. But we have a lot more information now, a lot more plants. We're updating things frequently, and so if you were to go to our website, you would see that we have each species is in our database. You can scroll down; they're alphabetically arranged, and there were 3 different areas here we wanted to point out for you. At the top left, you can do some sorting and filtering so that you could, if you were looking for instance, only coastal species that we had listed in California, you could do that way. And then secondly, we have in the middle for each of the plants. Now, we don't have this for our 10 newest species yet, but we will have eventually. The PAF is the plant assessment form. We'll go into that more in a few minutes. Some of the plants have a plant profile, which gives you links to things that we had in our newsletter, in our symposiums, past symposiums, and other information that we have available on these plants. Cal Weed Mapper, that would link you to a map of the species, and Doug showed you a screenshot of that interface. And some of the plants have species ID cards, not all of them, but that's also available if you're interested. And then to the right of that, we have the different ratings. So there are 3 different category ratings that we have, limited, moderate, and high. And then to the right of that, the alert status is for weeds with high impact and low distribution. So that's what our online database looks like. Moving on to the next slide. So I talked about the PAF, which stands for Plant Assessment Form. And this is, as Doug was talking about, the transparent criteria of how we list a plant in our inventory. You can see that there's 3 different sections and 13 criteria in this list. We have several questions on the impact of the plant. We have several more questions on the invasiveness and 2 questions on the distribution of the plant. So this is how we document our finding and justify our rankings of the different species. If you go to the next slide, you'll see, okay, so this is the criteria, and we're just pulling out for the first question how the criteria is based. So the folks who do the plant assessment forms go through each of these questions and do an evaluation based on the information we have available. So one thing I wanted to point out is this is just one of those 13 questions. This is all available on our website. We have a PDF document we produced back in 2003 that lines all of this stuff out. So those of you who would want to follow our system, you could just go and look up all of this information. Next slide, please. And as part of, and also for each of the criteria questions, we provide documentation. So sometimes we have peer-reviewed literature, which we're really happy about. Sometimes we have gray literature. Oftentimes we have a lot of observational information. Here we have one person cited who we talked to or emailed with, and we keep all that documentation so that people who are interested can take a look at that if they want to do that. But I think this is a really strong part of our system in that we have all of this stuff transparently up there for people to look at. Next slide, please. Also, when we do the listing of a particular species, we keep track of who was on the committee. We keep track of when the committee review was done, when it was evaluated, any general comments we may have, so that we can track back. You know, I did some updating of the taxonomy, for instance, from 2006. We had a major revision in California of our flora, and so we needed to fix those old names and put them in the new names. So when I do that kind of thing, I put in the comments, you know, hey, the name was updated here. And we do maintain synonymy too. So you can see we have the most recent taxonomy and we have a synonym just to help people figure out which plant we're talking about. Next slide, please. So Doug's started to touch on the new watch plant category. So previously in 2006, we only used the plant assessment form to rank species. And in 2016, last year, we started working on a new category using a predictive tool developed by UC Davis and University of Washington that was developed to help nurseries avoid risky plant introductions. So we decided to get that, to learn how to use that tool ourselves and go through a list of species that we had gathered from land managers and others. We get emails all the time. People say, hey, what about yellow glandweed, Ferenticelia viscosa? I think that's behaving invasively in my area. Here's some documentation. And so what I do is I gather all of those suggestions, and my predecessor also did this, and we had quite a long list of plants that people thought we should put in our inventory. So we decided, okay, we could take a subset of those plants. We kind of, we decided which might be the most useful to look at first, and we did assessment of close to 200 of those plants to see if they could potentially be either in the watch category or in our list. So if you go to the next slide, we use this predictive tool, and the predictive tool has 20 questions, and after you run each species through the 20 questions, it puts them in a category, either low risk of invasiveness, evaluate further, or high risk of invasiveness. And those 20 questions are similar to what we use in our same. They're gathered into 4 different areas. There's questions about the invasive history and climate matching, questions about impacts on native plants and animals, questions about the plant's reproductive strategies, and questions about dispersal. And it's a great tool because it's based on work that was done previously in Australia, and it's basically it's been tested. You know, it's been scientifically tested. So what they have looked at how it works for known invasive plants and whether it predicts it correctly. So it's a great tool, and we used it on our plants, and we found it to be pretty helpful. So if you go to the next slide, one of the important things and here's a picture of some of the different questions that are in the predictive assessment. So you can just get an idea. We wanted to say, has the species become naturalized where it is not native? And has the species been noted as being naturalized in the United States or the world in a similar climate? So so those are what the questions look like, and this predictive tool also includes references, so people can track back and see how the assessments were made. So now I want to go to the next tool that talks about the climate matching. And one outgrowth of this whole process was that we have this great tool that's been developed, that's at the URL you can see there on the slide, that's available to use, that integrates different layers. So we used an approach that was used by USD aphids, similar to theirs in their assessments. It combines ecozones, hardiness zones, and precipitation bands. So the way it works is you choose an area in the United States. So here we've chosen Missouri, and based on those 3 types of climate layers that occur in Missouri, it will predict for you where else in the world has a similar climate. So the next shot shows you where that would be in Europe. So you can see it's not you know, it's pretty good. It doesn't show all of Europe. It shows places with climate matches in those particular areas, and then the next shot is showing Asia. So the way we use this in the predictive assessment was we would start with California, because the predictive assessment, you have to choose the area of interest. We started with California, then we would look at a particular plant we were screening, look at its native range, see if any, so look at its native range, and where it's naturalized, does that match with California? Then another question looked at only where that plant has become invasive in the world, that's documented as being invasive, does that match any climate in California? So that gave us a good idea of how, you know, then we could score those questions in the predictive assessment and say, yes, it does have a match with California, or no, it doesn't, and that would contribute to its score. Next slide, please. So there's 1,800 non-native plant species in California, and so we chose 200 species from that list of suggestions that we compiled over the years. So we chose some of those, we ran them through the 20 question assessment, and we found that 86 plants, or 44% of the ones that we screened, were high risk, potentially invasive. And so then those are the plants that have that we are calling watch plants now in our inventory. And so so that's what we did with the predictive assessment. Next slide, please. So here's how we'll be depicting those new watch plants and our other inventory plants that we've assessed with the PAP. So once again, the difference between these 2 categories is that the plants that we consider invasive in California already, that we assessed with the PAF, and it showed that it was becoming invasive in wildlands would either be scored as high, moderate, or limited using the path. Those other plants, those 200 plants we assessed, the around 80 plants that became watch plants have not yet demonstrated that they are escaping into wildlands in California and causing impacts. But some of those species we screened, those are that we'll be doing those in our next round of path assessments, because some of them weren't known to be invasive already in California. We didn't have enough data. So that's what I've really been asking people who say, hey, you need to list this plant. I'm like, well, I need information, I need documentation that it's escaping into wildlands here in California and causing impacts. So in addition to those two categories that we'll be showing on our website in that database format type of thing that I showed you previously, we have the pending assessment category, and that's the holding place. Those are the nominations that people send us, but that haven't been assessed yet. Then we also have a list that has been assessed, but they weren't shown to be causing impacts in California. They weren't shown, we don't have enough, or maybe we don't have enough information, but we have done an assessment. So we have a number of plants in that category. And then a new thing that we'll be trying that we hope will be useful to people is to have this trending topics, category over here, maybe 5 to 10 key plants. We see that as maybe we're always having new introductions of plants into California. Somebody discovers something new. We want a way to kind of flag that for people, say, hey, keep a lookout for this. Or if there's a plant that maybe has been, in California a long time, but is just starting to expand exponentially, we want to highlight some of those. So that's something that we'll be doing in the future. Next slide, please. So when we do a plant assessment form, when we decide that we want to figure out if something is worthy of being in the inventory, we prepare the PAF, the plant assessment form that I've been talking about already. So it's drafted by one person, it's reviewed by a subcommittee, and then it's approved by the full committee. And the subcommittee and the full committee are really important groups of local experts who have a broad knowledge of invasive plants in their area and hopefully throughout the state. And so what happens is after we prepare that, it goes through the committee's approval. The committee says, yes, this draft is, in our opinion, ready to go out to public comment. We have a public comment period now, and we didn't do that before. So this is the first year that we have tried that process, and I'll talk to you a bit more in a few minutes about how that went, but we think it was a very valuable process. Next slide, please. So we had 18 experts on our committee from areas, and you can see we had government agencies, we have nonprofits, we had some local agency type folks, Botanic Gardens, the Nature Conservancy, University of California and Cooperative Extension, and one person from nursery industry who was really interested in invasive plants and native plant distribution. So we saw it as really important to have a wide variety of experts participating, and we wanted to have more than just agency staff and environmentalists on the committee. So we were happy to get the Botanic Gardens and the nursery industry representatives so that we could have some engagement from the horticultural community, and we're hoping to increase that in our next round of assessment. Next slide, please. So as I said, we just started with the public comment this year. It's our first time that we had done that formally, and we prepared all of our, we had our 10 new plants to add to the inventory, and then we had around 80 plants that watch plant category. So we posted those with a 60-day public comment period, and we had planned to have another 30-day comment period as needed. And we posted those on our website, and people responded through email. We did get one letter through the regular postal service. One thing that we want to try to do differently in the future is our review process was in the spring, which was not a great time for nursery industry partners to participate. So in the future, we hope to move our review time more to the winter, but also to try to engage them earlier in the process, perhaps just at the time when we're picking plants to run through the assessment. If they could even look at those at the beginning and see whether they were interested in them, then we could get their feedback later on in the process a little more easily. So we were looking for technical comments about the assessments, and we did get some of those. But we got lots of comments expressing concern over our work in general, and I'll share some of that on the next slide. But we got about 25 comments, and what our plan was we thought, okay, we have our drafts posted. If someone provides us information that indicates that we should change one of the categories of the path from, say we said it should be listed as moderate, and they thought there was more information that should have been changed to the high category, or, then we would have put those plants out for another 30 days. Basically, we would have received the comments, incorporated the comments, and then did another public review process. But that didn't really happen. Most of the technical comments we received, they were pretty much just small details, or perhaps adding additional distribution information, but not enough that it would change the overall assessment. Like maybe they said, oh, you said it was in Butte County, and I've also seen it in Tehama County, or something like that. So it wasn't a major increase in knowledge that would have changed the assessment, and so therefore we didn't do the second round of public review, but we had incorporated that in our timelines, so we were ready to do that if it was needed. And perhaps in the future we'll need to do that. Next slide, please. So some of our comments, perspective comments, as we've couched this, were basically about, just the study of invasive plants in general, whether this is a useful thing for us to spend our energy on, that by pointing out which plants are invasive, we are decreasing the value of natives in some way, that we are biased against non-natives, that we're supporting the use of chemicals, all kinds of things like that really weren't pertinent to the listing process. So, but we see this as a really good opportunity to dialogue with these folks about why we're even here. What are we doing? Why does CalEPC even exist? And hey, here's some of the things we do that are really useful, such as, hey, we're helping protect native biodiversity through information about invasive plants. So, there are several groups, and since we're headquartered in California's the Bay Area, there are groups that are very concerned in that area about herbicide use and about eucalyptus removal. So those groups got a hold of our request for comments and circulated it around in their organization. So we got several sets of duplicative comments. Basically the very same comment, but just the words changed a little bit. So we had a few of those, and basically all of the comments, we made them anonymous. We didn't give out the commenters' contact information, but we kind of clumped them together and pulled out the similar information and responded to it, kind of as a group. You know, so if there, for instance, if there was a comment that said, you know, you're saying that all non-natives are bad, we'd say no, we're focusing on invasives. We realize that there are non-native plants that aren't causing harm to the environment, and so, you know, that type of thing. So if you look on our website, we have a list of all the comments we received, and we have a response document that keys, each comment has a key that says, you know, see response number 2. And then you go to the Word document and there's some detailed information on that. And of course, on the technical comments, we responded to those specifically, and we said, yes, we've incorporated information in this part of our assessment. So people could see, okay, you received my comment, I made some change, and if it was a philosophical comment, then they could say, well, in general, here's our philosophy, but there really wasn't anything that we could really change in our assessment to address those types of comments. So the document we have posted, we want to encourage people to look at it because it could serve as a good start for a frequently asked question type of posting that National IPC has talked about putting together to address these kinds of concerns in the future. So once again, I just want to say how important it was for us to have a really engaged committee of technical support people to help us with this, because I can't say how great it was, those perspectives, and they had a lot of information and really helped us produce strong assessments. And now I think that's all I have to say on that, and I'm going to pass it back to Doug.
All right, thanks, Mona. That's a lot of slides with words, so here's one with pictures before more slides with words. And just to give you a sense for the major rating categories we have, through the traditional plant assessment form, we have high, moderate, and limited. So here's an example of a plant that is rated high, yellow star thistle, probably our state weed if we were to have one, covers 14 million acres of rangeland. A moderate tree of heaven, which is found over a lot of states. A limited and a new species, Voluteria tubuliflora, and that grows down in the desert, and it actually has an alert status on it because it does seem to be spreading quickly and of limited distribution. And then on the new watch list, shiny geranium is a plant where it's showed up in California. We know it's been a problem elsewhere, but it's not necessarily having an impact here yet, so we want it to be on people's radar screens. So moving on to what the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils has done, we started a process several years ago actually working through ASTM, which is a standards organization, and worked on that for a while and then ended up kind of jumping that and doing something different, which is publishing a simplified version ourselves and also passing some stuff on to APHIS, who is working on a more formal version. But basically, we compiled existing approaches to assessing and listing invasive plants, and we looked for the things they had in common and anything that looked like a strong feature maybe that one system would have, and putting those together into a standard or a best practices document. And through the process, especially through ASTM, there was lots of discussion with concerned industry representatives, and that's in part why we left ASTM, is because there was enough concern that that the process really wasn't going anywhere. But through that engagement with all the various concerns, and kind of like the comments we received on our CalIPC update, some of them were technical and some of them were more perspectives based, but from a different angle. We learned a lot about what could help build transparency and credibility. And so I think that was a key part of the process and helped a lot. So again, there are those two parts. There's the assessment methodology, the technical criteria based part, and there's the procedural process type part. And so for the assessment methodology on the national IPC checklist, there's a list of factors that need to be considered. And so that's kind of the content of criteria, and we'll talk about that next. There's scoring and categorization. So you need to have some sort of a system. And then there's documentation, or the requirement that there be documentation. And in terms of process, there's guidelines for planning the process, then for drafting the assessments, getting the assessments reviewed by a committee and by the public, and then finalizing and posting. So in terms of the methodology, the basic content falls into these categories, and each of these categories or factors has 2 to 6 subcategories. So it gets pretty fine-grained, but this is the overview. So that could be in a risk assessment for invasive plants, information about the plant's distribution, about its reproductive capacity, about its ability to establish and spread both with and without disturbance, impacts on the environment that are abiotic, and then biotic impacts both to plant communities and then to other organisms. In terms of scoring and categorization, this doesn't dictate here is how you shall do it exactly. Different people do it different ways. Some are points-based, others are logic-based. And the requirement is simply that it be logical and consistent, and that it categorize plants based on the level of environmental harm. So it's pretty broad and flexible in that requirement. And in terms of documentation, you need to say why a certain criteria is being scored a certain way and what that rationale is based on. Cite your sources. In terms of the process, first for planning, you need to select where you're making a list for, which plants you're going to look at, who is going to serve on a review committee, what the assessment methodology is that you're going to use to evaluate plants, and what your timeline is for the process. And that's the point at which, once you have all of that spec'd out, put the information out to the community, both as a heads up, but also so that they can give feedback on that. Maybe they think some additional plants should be considered, or some additional people should be on the committee. So that's the first place. The first public review spot is after you've actually kind of spec'd out the process. Once that review has come through and any changes have been made, then it's time to draft assessments. And once you've gotten those drafted and done your internal review with your committee, then it's time to put those out for revision, or excuse me, for public review. And then if there are any significant revisions, that's where those particular plant assessments would go back out for a second review period. And it is, as Mona mentioned, we posted a response document that addressed all the comments. And we also posted the comments themselves so that people didn't just see our paraphrasing, they saw the exact language that the person sent in. So that felt like it was fair to the commenters, so in case we were misinterpreting it all. And but it also allowed for the response document to be fairly focused and easier to read. And we did put in the response document, if you feel like you've been misrepresented anyway, please contact us. We haven't heard from anybody, but fair way to approach it. So I want to talk a little bit about where Cal IPC is going, and a little bit about where National IPC is going with this, and then open it up for questions. And there are, we've kind of skimmed the surface of different things, and there's a lot of in-depth details that are important, but figured we'd leave that for discussion now and later. I think this will be an ongoing discussion as IPCs work on their lists, but feel free to type things into your chat box that you've missed along the way, and we'll get to those at the end of the call. So Cal IPC is going to take, we need to make sure that people can make sense of this new watch column. There are folks who on the side of being concerned about anything being called invasive who want to be careful that we're not calling these plants invasive as well, and so do we. We want to distinguish. We want land managers to have some guidance as to how they should treat these species in terms of their prioritization. In terms of how we present the information, like on the website in a table, it's currently sortable and filterable in many different ways, but we want to add some new filters, and one in particular that will help with the list is this plant in horticulture? And we have some references for figuring that out, but we also have a whole community of people, horticulturalists, who can tell us. So I think that'll be very valuable. We're continuing to work on landscaping guidelines. We're very involved in Plant Right, which is a voluntary program where we work with partners from lots of different areas, including from the nursery trade, especially from the nursery trade. And so continuing to work on those voluntary guidelines. But then at the same time, because the state is moving forward with some updates to their building codes, and including moving water efficient landscaping guidelines into the building codes, now's a good time for us to try to figure out what's a reasonable approach to including, invasive plant guidelines into those building codes where they talk about landscaping. So we'll be continuing to do that. And this list, I think, will really help us do that and figure out different tiers for depending on how conservative somebody wants to be with their landscaping guidelines. For the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils, I think we want to encourage other groups to use the checklist, the National IPC. You're going through an update of your list. And so that involves kind of checking all your criteria just to make sure there's not something you're missing there that's kind of part of the common set. And then more likely is adjusting your process a little bit so that there is a formal public review process which adds transparency and credibility to the list. Consider including a new category of whether you call it watch, plant, or something else, where you are using a predictive assessment to gauge which of the things that are out there might become a problem in the future. That's an additional step, and we actually had funding from the Forest Service to pursue those 200, the assessment of those 200 plants. So it's not a trivial matter, but it's one of those things that we had thought about for a long time, and then we finally had the funding and were lined up to do it. So put that on the radar screen and think about it sometime in the future. And then to look for opportunities to use your lists of invasive plants in landscaping guidelines, and everybody's doing that already, no doubt. But to look for appropriate ways to get the information out, both on a voluntary kind of outreach basis, in working with nursery representatives in your area to look for consensus on plants that are problematic in the trade, and to perhaps get the word out a little more formally about those, as we're doing through the Plant Right process here in California. And then if there are actually building codes or other places where landscaping guidelines are formalized, which is happening more and more often as green building codes say, don't use invasive plants in your landscaping, look for appropriate ways to use your lists to support, when somebody says, well, what's invasive, to support those lists. And I guess I'll say one thing about that is that it's not always as simple as, well, just don't use anything on our list, because our lists typically grow out of what a land manager may want to know about in order to manage their land, and that isn't necessarily identical to a list of things that shouldn't be used in landscaping. And with that, I think we're done with the formal presentation. There are a couple of resources you might want to access. As Mona mentioned, our inventory information is on our website, and I think if you just go to calipsy.org, you can find it. But if you want to look specifically for that recent update, there is a main panel of our homepage. And then the checklist, I believe, has been posted on the National IPC website under resources. So if you're looking for that list to compare your process as you get set to do an update to your IPC's list, that's where you'll find it. And if you have suggestions, certainly let us know. You can let me know, and I'm on the executive committee, and I can pass it on to the other folks working on this. But I think that's it for now, and look forward to hearing any of the thoughts or questions that any of you have.
Okay, so Doug, we've got a handful of questions here, and I'll just go at them in order that they came in. So the first one was, "This is great. Did you look at the EICAT assessment tool?"
That's a good question, and I don't know if Nancy Lowenstein's on the phone and if it's possible to unmute her, but she may remember. So it'd actually be useful to, but no, based on the acronym, I don't recognize it, and we'd certainly be interested in hearing about it. Maybe whoever submitted that can type a little bit more in the chat and tell us what it is.
Yeah, that was Mark Frey. So, Mark, if you can give us a little bit more information. Okay, and I'll keep on going down the questions. The next one was, sorry, they missed the beginning of the presentation, so they were just trying to clarify what the consequences in California of listing a species to farmers, nursery industry, forest industries, landscaper, etc.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a very good question. So we're a nonprofit organization, and our list is entirely informational. The state Department of Food and Agriculture has a noxious weed list, which is regulatory. So their list informs things like what a nursery can and can't sell, and what can't be in weed-free forage, etc. So that their list is enforced by county agricultural commissioners, and there's a whole infrastructure around that. Our list is focused entirely on ecological. Regulatory list is began more as an agricultural list, and in later years has begun to consider environmental impacts. But for instance, in the code that specifies what can be a noxious weed, in California, it says basically anything that's a commodity can't be considered a noxious weed. So if, for instance, if a horticultural plant that's in the trade is also invasive, we would list it as invasive in wildlands, but the state would have a trickier time doing that. That is shifting over time with some conversations and advocacy, but our lists, and I think all IPC lists, don't really have any legal teeth, but a lot of the people that work on IPC lists also work on their state lists that do have more legal teeth. So I hope that answers that question. But in terms of implications, not a legal implication, but a utility, a landscaper can use our list to say, I don't want to use these plants, or at least the ones that are shown as invasive in my region. A land manager can use it to figure out what they want to control in their land or how bad something might be. An agricultural producer, the same thing. Just use it as an informational resource. However, it is, sorry, last thing, as we get closer to the green building codes, I mentioned landscaping ordinance language, which currently in California says you're discouraged from using any invasive plants, including or such as those listed on the CalIPC list. So that's where things start to run up against each other. Our list is developed as an informational list, but there's also a need for that information in those kind of landscaping guidelines. So that's still evolving.
Okay. So the next question, haven't heard any discussion on using these assessments and legislation legally restricting the shell importation and movement of plants. Sort of what you were just talking about, but where does Cal-IPC stand on this issue? And what about putting national restrictions on importation, sale, and movement of some of these plants?
Well, that's an interesting question in that one of the best risk assessments that's out there and that we have based the guidelines, the checklist on, is the USDA APHIS assessment protocol. And they use that for primarily for assessing plants for import that aren't already here. And so 237 list or the NAPRA not approved pending pest risk assessment list, where APHIS has done a risk assessment on a particular plant enough to say that looks potentially risky. So if somebody wants to import that, they're going to have to go through. They can't do it until a more detailed pest risk assessment has been done and cleared that plant as safe. So that's a beginning of closing the door on something coming in that's not safe. But I think different countries have their different perspectives, and Australia is looked on by, I think, weed managers as a great example of a place that really tries to keep things out, and it's looked on probably by someone from the nursery trade as a place that's overly restrictive on what can be used. So trying to find the right balance here, given the kind of the historical trajectory of the industry and the government system, I think we're moving in the right direction, but it's not something that's going to change fast, and it's a matter of finding the right balance between bringing in safe horticultural products that people like and being careful about weeding out the risky ones.
And so the next question was about website for the checklist, and that's now on the National IPC website. Is National IPC looking for opportunities to educate landscape training programs at university and vocational levels?
That's another great idea. National IPC themselves doesn't really have any capacity beyond the individual IPCs, and I'm personally not aware of programs, although I feel like Florida or some states probably have an effort at outreach to landscapers. Certainly here in California through the Plant Right program, there's an effort to get the information out to professionals, and through a bay-friendly landscaping program, there's an effort to train professionals, but also people getting into the field, if they want to get their bay-friendly certification, will have to get educated on things, including what's a weed and why wouldn't you use it in your landscaping. So I don't know how far that's gotten into universities so far. I think that the predictive tool that we talked about is designed primarily for avoiding risky imports for horticulture, and one of the next steps that the Plant Right group is working on centers across the country, and they're typically botanic gardens and universities that would help do screening for plants. So that's one step closer perhaps to the classroom, so that people are learning about this up front. And I think we did do a webinar for the Ecological Landscaping Association not long ago, and I don't know to what degree they reach into the classroom as well for professionals being trained, but I would imagine there's some connection there. So I think it's slowly seeping in.
So the next question is, this listing process similar to what most states use when adding species to their noxious weed list?
I would assume so. And if Dean were here, I would ask him. He may be here, but not unmutable. But yeah, I think the impacts assessment and things like reproductive capacity and distribution would be the same. The difference may be that whereas our impacts are, we're looking at ecological impacts, a state noxious weed list would likely look at economic impacts, maybe even as the priority, or probably as the priority first. So just recalling the federal definition of an invasive species, it's a non-native species that causes economic, environmental harm or harm to human health. So they'd be looking at all of those, whereas we're looking specifically at the ecological impact. So the factors looking at impacts, that list would be longer.
So next question, are there top things you would do differently if advising another IPC? In particular, any thoughts on different approaches advisable to an IPC made up of multiple states and therefore likely more stakeholders?
Well, that raises a couple questions. One is the regionality. So our list is for the state of California, but California's got, deserts and rainforests and a lot of different habitats. And so that's one of the weaknesses in a statewide list. And so that's a direction we're hoping to head in the future too, resources allowing, to enable it to be more regional. So that would be one of the considerations for a multi-state list, is to make sure that just ecologically, the regionality was taken into account. But then in terms of the stakeholders, you want to have strong representation, and so I guess you'd want to be careful about how unwieldy and large a group could get. But for us, as Mona said, it was a huge advantage to have a large group, a large committee to inform the effort. Not everybody has a ton of time, so the folks that do and have the expertise can really help with reviewing the assessments. But everybody on that committee represented an important stakeholder. And so getting their final approval is important for the credibility of the list. So yeah, I think there's a longer conversation there about recommendations for pursuing a list for a multi-state area, and certainly happy to talk about that more offline.
This is, I think, kind of a follow-up, but in the same realm, where is National IPC on the issue of solving this issue on a national basis? Many, not all plants are truly national issues.
Well, yes and no. I think some are national issues and some are pretty localized. And I think National IPC is, again, only got the capacity that the individual IPCs have, and for the most part, IPCs are voluntary, so people are doing this in addition to their day job. But there has been progress on the national level on things like the Q37 preventative screening for imports, and that's important. I think there are other areas like funding for like local weed management areas that could come federally to complement state and local funding that would be really important and could get a lot done on the ground. Chuck has been very involved in the North American Invasive Species Network, which includes Canada and Mexico, but is a national, tri-national effort. And at the recent conference in Savannah, there was some progress made on sharing data, especially mapping data, distribution data for invasive species. And so that on the control end, I think is a hopeful direction for catching things early, finding the leading edges, finding the outliers at the landscape level, and having strategic management. But so at the national level of keeping new plants coming in, I think that's, work is being done on that. It's not solved, but there is progress on that. But there are so many things that are here already. We've already got our hands full with things spreading and the new things that are potentially going to become invasive. So there are a number of different fronts to work on. And so I'd say the simple answer is no, National IPC does not have this problem solved at the national level.
So, and I think this is from a Cal IPC perspective, Do you have any paid staff, or is your whole council volunteer?
So Cal-IPC does have paid staff. We have five individuals, about 3.5 FTE equivalent, and then we have a strong community. We have a board of directors and a membership of 500 or so, and a strong community of experts that contributed to this. So there was a ton of in-kind effort that went into this listing process, but there was paid coordination from our staff to make it happen. So that's extremely helpful.
Is the assessment tool you used, and maybe I'm missing, if I misinterpret this, please correct it, but is the assessment tool you use PRE through PlantRight or modified in some way?
It is PRE through PlantRight, which is a neat system. And as Mona mentioned, it's developed for the horticultural community to avoid risky introductions. And so it's a tool that, because we are very involved in PlantRight, they allowed us to use, but it's still in the beta testing phase. And they hope to have it available for others in the future, but for now, both because kinks are being worked out and also because it's really important to encourage adoption by the nursery community. They're taking it slowly with having the invasive plant management community dive in there as well.
So how many hours of staff time roughly did it take to set up the Cal-IPC inventory process? What was the average amount of time spent on a single species assessment?
Well, in terms of the single species assessment, I'll pass that to Mona, but for the overall, that's a tough question, but we did have a multi-year grant at $50,000 a year to work on this. And like I say, we had a ton of in-kind contributed by Cal-IPC members. And that was mostly, we had 10 new plants to our inventory and then reviewed 20 plants with the predictive assessment. We do plan to continue updating on an annual basis, not at that scale. And the cost in dollars and time is definitely something we'll be paying attention to. But Mona, I know at least on the predictive assessment forms, there's a field for how many hours was spent on it, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have a sense for how many hours total goes into a PAF or a predictive assessment?
Sure. So as with many invasive plants, you probably all know that some of them we have a lot of information on, like yellow star thistle Doug mentioned, or some of them we have barely anything because maybe nobody studied it before. So for the predictive assessment tool, if we're starting a new species, it would take between 2 to 4 hours to fill one out. And then we also had yet another committee on the predictive assessments that reviewed everything and would create issues if we needed to change anything, and then we would have to fix those in order for that to be finalized. So 6 to 8 hours per species for the total effort, and that would be for the person preparing it plus the committee. Then for our Cal-IPC plant assessment forms, those were a lot more detailed. That took more time. So I would say, perhaps preparing one of those 8 to 10 hours to get all the information together. And then we had several rounds of committee review. So perhaps, 15 to 20 hours total per species, but that includes all the committee time too. That's all I had, Doug. Go ahead.
I think it's back to me. So how does this assessment differ from, I guess, an EDRR assessment? And do you only do you only have one category of invasives, I guess is what that question is.
Well, so for EDRR, we're often looking at, I mean, yes, it's very similar, but we're also looking at spatial information. So it's unusual that there's a brand new plant species that we know about that's very limited. So usually eradication in a region that we're after. So something may be too widespread to control in one area, but we can contain it, but in another region, it could be eradicated. So we would be looking at this evaluation, how does the plant rate, but also at the spatial distribution. And that's where that cow weed mapper tool comes in.
And Mark clarified on that assessment, it was the environmental impact classification of alien taxa that was a tool developed in Europe in 2014, and that has been adopted by the IUCN as a standard assessment tool.
That rings a bell. I don't know that we, actually, I do think that we looked through that as a committee. It wasn't part of our initial set of criteria systems, because I came out after that, but because we did start this a long time ago. But we looked through I'm remembering a journal article where it was laid out, and we went through and matched things up. But I think that is a really promising effort, and making sure that we're synced up with that is really important. As I remember, and I and others can talk about this later, but yeah, we saw good overlap and no red flags.
And I'm trying to pick and choose. We've got a lot of questions. You mentioned a horticultural component will hopefully be included in the assessment in the future. Can you flesh out some ideas of the risk assessment questions that will address plants in cultivation?
Yeah, so actually I wasn't saying that there would be horticultural information considered in the assessment, more just that when the plants are shown in a table, that there would be a checkbox whether or not it is in horticulture, so that if you wanted to take a look at our list and only see the plants that are found in horticulture, you could filter that way. So if I wanted to say I'm in southern coastal California and I want to know what are the weeds that are actually horticultural plants in my region, you could do all that filtering. Because as it stands now, you'd get a bunch of plants that, like yellow star thistle, that you're not going to be considering as a horticultural part of your landscaping. So you'd like to filter that out.
I'm wondering if there's something you can say about green building codes in regard to invasive plants. What building code organization are attentive to this? And most of building is regulated at the municipal level, right? Do you know of state efforts to regulate invasive plants in new developments?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's a field I'm only slightly familiar with, but there's everything from the International Green Construction Code, and I think it's ASHRAE something that exist out there as model codes, and then they're adopted at state levels, at local municipal levels. And so what we've been working on most recently is there's a process in California for updating the state's green building code. And my understanding is that there's a certain part of that is mandated for municipalities to adopt, but then they can adopt additional parts of it that are perhaps selective and above and beyond. So we're looking to make sure that these planting elements are in there as well. My colleague is motioning to me that our train is getting dangerously close. So probably about three more minutes would be. Chuck, was this planned for an hour and a half?
Yeah,
I love all the questions.
I think we were just an hour, and we're over.
Okay.
If there's any more,
A day on this.
Yeah. How did you advertise the public comment period?
Good question. So we put it out, we posted everything on our website, and then we emailed everyone we could think of, all our normal network of folks. But then because we work with PlantRight, we have lots of contacts with the nursery trade and with the nursery trade associations through that. So we made sure to send them direct emails and say, hey, this is this is a good opportunity. We'd love to have input from your folks. So that was basically it, putting all the information on our website and then sending emails to everyone we could think of and asking them to pass it along.
How many people worked on the initial assessments before going to the subcommittee for review, and how long did the typical assessment take? I think you may have covered some of that, but.
Yeah, I could pass that back to Mona, but I think the assessments were typically done by one person, and then there'd be a small committee of folks that would review that to say, yep, that all looks good and consistent with the way I did it, because they were often the subcommittees were made up of other people who were also drafting their own assessments. And yeah, I think Mona addressed the time question on that.
Yeah, that's correct. We had an initial, someone would draft them up and then committee revisions. So in both cases of our predictive assessment and in our plan assessment form, we had one person start with the drafting.
So, and we could end with this question. For a plant like Ailanthus, can we create a national repository of assessments that we can all share?
It's a great idea. I think because all these assessments are going to have virtually the same questions, the scoring systems might be different, but you want to have the same information to cite. And yes, there's the published literature, but then there's all of the professional knowledge that you could draw on too. I think it's a great idea to have a national repository for assessments, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and I'm not sure necessarily that National IPC could host that, which is the second part of that question. But just because National IPC is strictly volunteer, except for at the national level volunteer anyway. And so, but I think maybe it's something that as these are built, more organizations could help make that happen, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and certainly, we've had some luck getting funding for assessment, and so there may be a funder out there who would be interested in helping to make that a reality. So that's a great idea, and it's good to put it on the radar screen so we can aim towards it. And I think that goes to the time and dollars question very much, because if everybody's looking up their own information, that takes a lot longer than if you can see what's already been collected.
And I'll throw this one in because I know you want to answer it. Is in your assessment protocol, what is a baseline requirement for suitable geospatial data? Is point data, presence, absence acceptable to an assessment, or verifiable acreage and density required?
Oh my. Well, the distribution questions on the assessment are pretty broad and don't get down to a lot of fine details. So that question is definitely relevant when it comes down to mapping and setting strategy on the ground and at the landscape level. But in terms of our assessments, just knowing what's out there and how much of it there is, that's a little fine-grained.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. And Doug's email is on the screen. So if you have additional questions or I didn't get to your question, then I'm sure he will be glad to take them. And we're going to save this and it'll be posted on the National IPC website by sometime next week at the latest. So.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the questions and dialogue.
Thanks, Chuck.
No problem.